Now you might be asking why I'm wearing a beanie in the beginning of August, and it's not because I got caught out on my bike in a torrential downpour, almost struck by lightning, and I'm pretty sure some hail pelted me in the back of the head. I just like to come up with very specific hypothetical examples. Moving on. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of those things, endurance sports. So if that's something that you're into, well, you know where the buttons are. If you don't, I drew a map. I'm here for you. That took me a long time. No? Never mind. But today's video, I wanted to share my top 5 tips to prepare for your first century ride. This is going to be expounding on some of the ideas that I talked about in some of the route badge hunting rides that I did that people really liked at the end of spring of this year. And this is to help prepare people for doing those rides or taking them outdoors, how to tailor your training, how to plan accordingly, things that can be really helpful if you're trying to go for that really daunting 100-mile mark. Now, if you didn't catch my video a couple of weeks ago, I did announce that I will be doing a century ride this coming Saturday, August 7th, 2021, for charity. It's called the Ride for Roswell, and it's going to be supporting the Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. If you're interested in checking out that video, or you're interested in donating to a really worthy cause, I'm going to leave both of those links down in the show notes, as well as the pinned comment down below. It is a really good opportunity for me to get my century ride in for the year, and I thought in sharing that experience, it would be a good time to help those people who are century curious, to figure out how they can go ahead and attack this goal for themselves. Maybe you'll be trying to do that by the end of the fall or the winter, depending on where you live, or maybe you're just looking to do it next year. But hopefully these 5 tips will help you along your way. So let's get right into it. The first tip I want to share is going to seem, well, a little bit obvious, but it's to train, and to train lots. Ride as much as you can. I understand a lot of you out there are time crunched, and that is not going to preclude you from successfully doing a century ride. But what you may want to do is be a little bit more creative with how you spend those hours available. Maybe you've got to cut some deals with the fam. You know, you've got to work things out with the significant other and the kiddos if you've got them around, to work in some longer rides, because that's really going to be what prepares you for a century ride. You don't have to ride 15, 20, 30 hours a week to prepare for a century, but you do need to kind of work those miles into the legs over time, and you need to acclimate yourself to being on a bike for an extended period of time. So what I would recommend doing is try to reappropriate those hours that you have available to make them a little bit heavier. If your weekends are your day off, try to get some very long rides in at least a couple of times a month. And by long rides, I mean in excess of 3 hours. I know that it is tough to carve out that time, but if you can get up early and get out there, or, you know, make a deal again with the family, you know, that Thursday night, that workout that I usually do, I'm going to pass up that Thursday night workout, but I need to trade that hour, that 90 minutes off for a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning ride. The more of those that you can incorporate, the more acclimated you're going to be able to get to spending a long time in the saddle. It doesn't matter how fit you are per se. There really is some preparedness and fatigue resistance that you cannot get without doing those long rides. If you can do them indoors, great. If you can do them outdoors, even better, because it gets you used to the road vibration and the stabilization. But the better that you can prepare your body for the actual needs on the day, the better. You'd be surprised at how fit people can be. You know, they can ride at a high level of power for an hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours, but they start to break down precipitously because they have not prepared their body for the actual stabilization and to be in that position of riding the bike, which is not altogether a natural position, for a long period of time. The more that you can acclimate the body to those needs over time, the better off that you are. A lot of people who do their first century often report back things like, wow, I didn't realize how weak my back was, how weak my core was, how much pain I had in my shoulders and my neck, because I wasn't used to being in that, even an upright cycling position for that period of time. You do have to build up those muscles to adapt. So again, if you can put those long training hours in on those weekends, or if you have days off on Wednesday or Thursday, that's great. This is not to say that you have to do the entire length of a ride. Nobody's saying that you have to do a century every weekend to prepare for a century. century. But if you can get at least, halfway to 2/3 of the way there, you're doing pretty well. If you can stay on the bike for 3 to 4 hours, you can usually protract that out to do a century ride. But I'm going to talk about some ways to be strategic about how you plan your ride as well to make sure that you are prepared for the time in the saddle in the next couple of tips here. Now, if you really cannot spend that kind of time on the bike, I understand. People have responsibilities, families, things that just do not allow them to leverage that time. Can you get 1 or 2 in before the event or the day that you have scheduled to do this? If you can at least sneak a couple of those in, that would be great. But a good way to substitute those longer rides is to work in some strength training. Work some dynamic kettlebell exercises, some compound movements at the gym if you can. It just helps you to strengthen up the core and the stabilizer muscles a little bit so they become more resilient for that long period of time in the saddle. Again, being on the indoor trainer, it's hard because you're in that fixed position. You don't have that bike sway underneath you, but you also are a little bit less diligent with holding a particular position. You don't have road vibration. You don't have wind. There's a lot of elements that you leave out when you're on the indoor trainer. So if you could try to simulate some of that outdoors, or focusing on some really solid gym work, really putting some focus into that core and hip girdle area, which is often not what people think about when they go cycling. And don't neglect the upper body as well, because you're going to need those arms, those shoulders, that whole upper body to support yourself. It's one of your 3 points of contact on the bike, so don't ignore it. Gym work is something that you should be incorporating into your training regimen anyway, but if you can lift that a little bit to prepare for a longer ride, or you can do those long rides outdoors to prepare, you'll be in pretty good shape, even if you are a lower volume athlete. Now, on the note of spending several hours and being capable and comfortable in the saddle for that period of time, that brings me to tip number 2, and that is getting a good bike fit. Now, if you're a person who is going to commit to cycling as a part of your lifestyle, you're going to spend years doing this, I always recommend, if you have the budget for it, go in and pay for a good solid bike fit, usually a computerized bike fit by a professional. It really does help you in terms of being comfortable for the long term and to increase your power execution. However, that is very costly. It can be anywhere from $200 to upwards of $500 to get a proper bike fit. That is not necessarily practical for everybody, especially if you're just kind of recreational and you're just trying to do that century for the first time. That's fine. If you cannot do that, there are other resources that you can use, right? Really pay attention to some of those things that you feel on the bike, because what happens is any little niggle or kind of small ache or pain that you get while you are riding on a bike for a short period of time, maybe it's an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, that's just going to exponentially increase as you spend more time in the saddle. Be cognizant of those things, and maybe you can bring your bike to your local bike shop and they can just kind of do one of the old school fits, right? Measuring their inseam, really looking at that plumb line from the knees, making sure that the saddle's in a good position. You give them that feedback, right? Oh, my hands tend to go a little bit numb, or I get a little pain in the upper portion of my left trapezius muscle. Whatever that might be, knee pains, they could take a look at some things and maybe dial some stuff in for you. There's also some resources online, including videos, books, pictures that can help you to maybe dial in that fit a little bit with some trial and error. If you have an indoor trainer, it's a good opportunity to test some of those changes out. You tweak something, you see how it feels, maybe using a mirror to see how your position is. You're not stuck with the fit that you have just because you can't afford an expensive bike fit, but it is not something that you should ignore, because like I said, any small nuance, anything that you feel for shorter rides, it's just going to compound and get worse and worse, and it's really going to draw on you physically and mentally when you start to tick away those miles and get closer to that 100-mile mark. And the last thing you want to do is to break down and quit your ride, not because of your fitness, but because something's uncomfortable or something hurts, or worse yet, you're risking injury for the sake of a long ride. So do what you can to dial in that fit. Make sure that what you have is comfortable. Look at some of the low-hanging fruit. Make sure that you have a good quality pair of chamois. That is one thing you don't want to skimp on, right? Take that budget and put it in something that you're going to put under the rear end there, because it can really forgive a lot of sins if you have a nice comfortable pair of chamois. But make sure that your saddle is comfortable for you as well. A lot of times the cheap saddle that comes with bicycles isn't the greatest. And please, 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 please don't put a gel seat on your saddle. For people who are new to riding, I'm not making fun of you. If you're one of those people who has put a gel seat on your bike, don't do that. It is so counterproductive to being comfortable for long periods of time on the bike, because that gel seat does not offer the support that is needed for your sit bones to maintain long hours in the saddle. If it did, all the riders in the Tour de France would be using it, but they're all using pretty firm, hard saddles. There's a reason for it. It's not supposed to be plush. It's supposed to be supportive in a manner to be comfortable. So if you're having some issues with your saddle, don't cover it up. You may have to invest in a new saddle. You might get into one for anywhere from $50 to several $100s. Again, that investment is going to depend on you and your budget and how uncomfortable you might be in a particular saddle. But those are some things to look at. Getting some good quality bar tape. You can usually use a nice thicker bar tape if you're more of an endurance rider. There's a lot of road vibration. It does help if you have something a little thicker. You could, if you like them, to use gel gloves. It helps the hands to be a little bit more comfortable and take up some of that road vibration as well. There are things to look at to increase your comfort on the bike, but fit is the first thing that I would look at. Get the fit dialed in, get it to the point that you are pretty comfortable, and then everything on top of that is an enhancement. The next thing I'm going to recommend is not so much an actionable tip, but it is something that's going to help you mentally. And that is to not attach yourself to a time commitment. And I said this back when I don't remember if it was the Uber Pretzel route or if it was the PRL full, but please do not commit to a number in your head for how fast you're going to finish this century. There are ways to do it faster. You can ride in a group. That will certainly increase your average speed if you're looking to get a decent time. But even then, if you're going to go out with 5 of your buddies and go for a 100-mile ride, don't assume that when you guys do your typical Tuesday night group ride for 90 minutes, you guys hold 20 miles an hour on average, so you're just going to be able to extrapolate that over the course of 100 miles. Again, bodies break down. Things start to get a little bit more uncomfortable. If you're not built up to that level of endurance or fatigue resistance, whatever you hold in hour 1, 2, 3, even if it's not a high percentage of your total threshold power or whatever metric you're using to measure that, you are going to decline in your power execution over time as you kind of burn up those muscle stores if you don't have the base of endurance to cover that length of an event. So don't ruin yourself mentally in the course of a long ride, because that can really break you. Mentality is a large component of being able to endure a ride of this magnitude. It feeds right into your physical ability. When you start to break down mentally, you start to break down physically even faster than you would generally speaking. So don't add insult to injury and have that number in your head and think that, oh, well, I thought I was gonna be able to do the century in 5 hours, and 4 hours comes along and you still have 40 miles left. That can be really demoralizing. But I'll talk about some ways to kind of manage the amount of time that you're spending on the bike in the next tip. Under promise and over deliver. Right? Count on at least 6 hours on the bike. You can be reasonable. It's not like you don't know if it's going to be, 4 hours or 10. You can have somewhat of an expectation in your head, but don't come up with a direct goal. I want to hit 5 hours. Don't do that to yourself the first time around. Use this first century to kind of get a feel for what's going on. Take a look at where your areas of opportunity are, some of your priorities in terms of training for the next one. And then for century number 2 and beyond, that's where you can start putting some goals in place. So the next tip is to really pick an intelligent route. Your first century, even if you're used to climbing quite a bit, I wouldn't pick a route that's going to give you 10,000 feet of vertical gain for your first one, right? First of all, it's just going to slow down your average speed and take even longer than you can think of in your head. But it's going to break you down. If you haven't done a century ride before, there's a lot of draw that's going to take out of those even type 2 muscle fibers as those type 1 muscle fibers start to fatigue. If you burn those up even more by doing a lot of climbing, even if you try to keep that intensity a little bit lower, you're going to be drawing on those stores, burning up those matches that you may not have built up to cover that 100-mile distance. 100 miles is no joke. There's not a whole lot of riders that are out there doing century rides on the regular. Some people are, but they had to spend a lot of time over years building up their fatigue resistance to be able to do that in their current state. So don't just take whatever you do now and then extend it by a multiple to get you to 100 miles. I think that goes without saying, but you would be surprised. Some people are used to going out, and in their local area, they usually find a climbing ratio of like 1,000 feet to every 10 miles. That's no joke. That's a lot of climbing. What you may have to do in that regard is be a little bit more strategic. If you live in a really hilly area, you may have to find a shorter loop that you can do and just do that multiple times. Can you find something that has a very marginal or nominal amount of climbing for a 20 or 30 mile loop, and then you may just have to do that 4, 5, 6 times. It might not be the most compelling or the most fun, but if your goal is to just hit that 100-mile benchmark, be intelligent about it your first time around. Don't just kind of back yourself into a corner and try to do this exceptionally hard route so you can have a unique route for the entire 100 miles and then risk failing on the day. Another piece of that is to know the route, understand what's going on. If you think that there's going to be certain points where you need to stop, use the restroom, pick up more supplies, have a bailout, right? Something where you can have people come to. If you're going to do this solo, maybe you want to make sure that you're staying in places where you have cell connection. So if you have to call somebody to come bail you out because you've had 3 flat tires and you only brought 2 tubes with you and you don't want to hoof it for 20 miles until you find cell phone connection, just make sure you're intelligent about how you're planning your route so that you can execute on the day. But I wouldn't really recommend doing your first one alone, honestly. I would recommend doing your first one, whether it's in something like a charity ride or if it's just with a group of friends. It's a very tough and nerve-wracking undertaking. Even when you're experienced to do 100 miles solo, I wouldn't recommend doing that for your first ride unless you've been pretty close in terms of those miles in the past. And tip number 5, and I know I talked about this during the badge route hunting videos, but it bears repeating, and that's to focus on your nutrition. As the miles continue to tick upwards, it's the more upside down you're going to get on calories. It's going to be almost impossible for you to keep up on calories per execution, even at an endurance pace for most people over the course of 100 miles. The body can only take in so much. You're only going to want to chew and eat so much when you are on a 100-mile ride. You are going to go upside down. If you stayed calorie for calorie with what you were expending for a 100-mile ride, you are not going to feel very well. So you're going to have to be a little bit more carb-centric when you are riding those rides, making sure that you are bringing in enough sugar. Usually between 60 and 90 carbs per hour is a good rule of thumb. You may have to use a lot of race nutrition type of stuff, right? Blocks, gels, bars. Be prepared, be planning for how you are going to execute that, what you're going to eat and when. Make sure that you've practiced using those fuels. Make sure that your stomach is adapted to taking those things, because going out and buying an ass load of gels and using them for the first time on a century might set you up for some real disappointment on the day. So know how many calories you need, plan that out, plan how you're going to carry it. Like I said in the last tip about the routes, know where you're going to stop and refuel. It's very unlikely for most people to be able to carry enough fuel, especially drinks, even liquid calories, on board for the course of a 100-mile ride. So know where you're going to stop to refill on those things. A good strategy to use is to use that kind of loop methodology. Maybe you can find yourself, a 33-mile loop where you take enough fuel on board to cover that 33 miles and maybe you circle back to your car. You could have a cooler with some fresh drinks, maybe a sandwich, some extra gels, whatever you need, so you don't have to be too laden with, bottles and nutrition on your bike, on your frame, on your person. Come back around for 3 times for that loop. You can come grab your accoutrements, restock, get rid of old empties, and then go back around again and repeat the cycle. Just have a plan for how you are going to fuel and maintain enough calories on board. Bring more than you think you are going to consume. You might drop something. Something might not be suiting you. Have a little bit of variety so you don't get that palate fatigue, because sometimes that gets really daunting when you're starting to mentally and physically break down and you just cannot stand another orange block or another lemon lime drink or another, chocolate flavored goo, whatever it is that you're using. Just make sure you have enough variety as you go around. If you can incorporate real food, that's a good option. Some people really start craving real food, something savory, whatever it might be. If you got to stop at a gas station, if you have that in your car, whatever that is, make sure that you nail your nutrition piece, because that is the last reason you want to break down on the bike, because that is 100% within your control. That has nothing to do with how you've trained or your power or anything up to that point. As long as you know that you can digest those foods well, failing to plan is planning to fail. So make sure you have your nutrition dialed. And I'm going to give you one more bonus tip, and that is to make sure everything is charged. If you have electric shifting, make sure it's charged. If you have power meter, make sure it has new batteries in it. Make sure that you charge up your head unit. I had a ride the other day where, I was using the routing feature and I was using the workout feature, and I had 40% left to do what was over a 4-hour ride, and I just thought that it was going to be more than enough because I get well more than 4 hours on 40% of my battery life, and it ended up dying on me 15 miles from home. Garmin, if you're watching, maybe an Edge 1040 series with, solar ability to charge, take my money. Let's get on that. Anyway, just make sure all that stuff is charged up. Your phone, if you can carry a small battery pack with a short cable attached, it could really do wonders. If you can shove it in your saddlebag, you can put it in your back pocket. The last thing you want to do is to be out there and have all of those things that you can use to find your way home or to reroute yourself, or if you get lost, right? You want to be able to look something up on your phone or look something up on your head unit. Just make sure that you have power on board, because if anything's going to ruin your day, it sure as shit shouldn't be technological failure. So again, back to the planning element, make sure that you're planned up accordingly. But one of those really pernicious and sneaky failures that you run into is just all of the batteries, all of the things power. Make sure that you have it completely dialed in, prepared for the night in advance, and be prepared on the day to do your ride. But these are just 5.5 of the many tips and tricks that you can use to execute your very first century. The idea is to go into your event feeling strong and confident, because you want to finish the ride as strong as possible. Yes, it's going to take a lot out of you, but feeling excited and invigorated by that kind of accomplishment is what I want for all of you out there. I don't want any of you to limp it over the finish line thinking, God, I never ever want to do that again. If you follow these tips and you go into your ride prepared, you might be drained and exhausted, but you're going to feel like, when am I going to do this again? And that's the greatest feeling out there. I love doing long rides myself. I try to bake them in at least a couple of times a month because I just like doing it. Getting out there, maybe it's with a podcast, maybe it's in silence looking at the trees. I get to work out a lot of those thoughts in my head. I like to shed a lot of the stress from the week on those nice long rides. And getting the confidence to build up to the point where I can do these with regularity was a great process for me, but it all started with that century. The longest ride I'd ever done before that point was 60 miles, and when I did my very first century, the feeling of accomplishment that I had for that particular ride, I will never ever forget it. But I know that several of you have done 100 milers and beyond in the past. If you have tips for people who are new, please leave them in the comments below. I could not possibly make a video for all of them because my videos are long to begin with. You don't want to sit here all day. But share the tips with one another, share them with the community. Sometimes people have come up with just the neatest things, ways that they've set up their bike, little tips and tricks that they could use that nobody ever thinks of. Leave them in the comments below. Share them with your fellow cyclists out there. If you got any value out of this video, if you wouldn't mind hitting a thumbs up, it really helps the algorithm to shine favorably on my little channel here that we built together. Subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. See you.